The colonel had already signed the letter. It sat in the outbox on his desk, folded into thirds, her name typed clean across the front, and he had shaken his head once when he signed it because a person that small dying in a place that far away seemed like a clerical error waiting to be corrected. Sergeant Ren Kovach, 29 years old, recovery unlikely. He capped his pen. 200 clicks south. Ren was awake in the dark, listening to the wind come down off the ridgeline, and she did not feel dead. She felt cold in the feet and clear in the head, which was how she always felt before the thing that everyone said could not be done. She had been listed as killed in action 19 hours ago. The listing was wrong. She was going to prove it in the one language nobody could argue with. "They think you're gone," the radio hissed. It was Diaz, 30 clicks back at the relay, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Whole net's got you as KIA, Ren. They stopped calling your sign an hour ago." She keyed the handset once. "Then I've got nobody expecting me." She looked up the valley toward the black shape of the compound, where 4 men from a downed aviation crew were being held, and where every plan the task force had drawn up had died on the whiteboard. That works. If you have ever been counted out by people who never bothered to learn your name, stay with this one. Before we're through, a woman the whole task force had already buried is going to stand in a room full of men who signed her death letter, and not one of them is going to be able to look at her. Hit subscribe. Tell me what city you're listening from, and stay to the end. Because the hardest thing she does isn't the shot. It's what she says after. Ren learned to shoot in a grain silo, which is a thing she never told anyone in the Army because it sounded like a joke, and she was tired of being a joke. Her grandfather ran a failing farm on the high desert, all wind and dust, and a horizon so flat it looked drawn with a ruler. And the silo was the tallest thing for 40 miles. When she was 11, he took her up the ladder to the top hatch and handed her an old bolt action and said, "The wind up here lies to you. It says one thing at your face and does another out there. Your whole job is catching the lie." She had not understood him then. She sat in the hatch with her legs hanging out over 100 feet of nothing, and she missed the fence post 6 times. On the 7th, she caught it. Not because she aimed better, because she stopped believing the wind on her cheek and started reading the dust twisting off the dry field 300 yards out, the way it curled and doubled back where 2 currents met. The wind at her face was going left. The wind at the post was going right. Between them was a seam, and the seam was the truth. "There it is," her grandfather said. He did not smile. He was not a smiling man. But he put one hand flat on the top of her head for a second, and that was the whole of it. Wind's got layers, Ren. Same as people. The loud one on top is never the one that gets you. He said that a lot in the years after. The loud one on top is never the one that gets you. She had rolled her eyes at it 100 times. She would give anything now to roll her eyes at it once more. He had been dead 2 years, and she had missed the funeral because she was in a country she was not allowed to name, and that was a debt she had never found a way to pay. Because you cannot apologize to a man who is in the ground, and she had never once said out loud that she was sorry she wasn't there. It sat in her like a stone. She carried it up every hill. The Army had found her at a state qualification match she'd entered on a dare, where she'd outshot 2 active duty teams while wearing her grandfather's old barn coat. A recruiter with a clipboard had watched her group 5 rounds into a space you could cover with a playing card at 600 yards, and had said out loud, "Who taught you that?" And she had said, a dead man, and packed up her rifle and left. They called her for 3 weeks straight. She let them. She was good. Everyone who watched her shoot knew she was good. The problem was that nobody watched her shoot before they'd already decided what she was, which was small and quiet and female and easy to talk over. She had a wall of qualification badges she never displayed, and a folder of scores she never mentioned, and a habit of letting men explain her own trade to her until they ran out of breath. It cost less than arguing, most days. The man it cost the most with was Master Sergeant Boyd Ackerman, who ran the precision element she was attached to, and who had decided the first day she arrived that she was a diversity checkbox with a rifle. Ackerman was loud, and he was skilled, and the two things fed each other. He could shoot. He would tell you he could shoot. He would tell you at length, in front of whoever was standing there, and if you happened to be a 5'3" woman, he had already filed under not a real operator. He would tell you while looking straight through you at the men behind you. Ranges are for people who can carry their own gun a full patrol, he said, the first week in the chow tent, loud enough for the table. No offense, Kovach. Physics is physics. He'd smiled when he said it, the way men smile when they've decided a cruelty is just a fact. She had not answered. She'd looked at her food. The new lieutenant across from her, a kid named Foss who hadn't learned yet who to laugh with, had watched her not answer, and something had moved across his face that he didn't have words for. He'd seen her on the range that morning. He'd seen her put 10 rounds through effectively one hole while the wind was doing 3 different things across the valley, and he'd seen her do it without seeming to work at it. The way you watch someone parallel park a truck in one clean motion and can't say what exactly they did that you couldn't. He didn't have the vocabulary. He just knew the chow tent version and the range version were not the same woman, and only one of them was true. Not everyone was Ackerman. There was a warrant officer named Petra Salas, who flew the little reconnaissance birds, an older woman with gray coming in at her temples, and 40 years of desert in her face, who had taken one look at Wren's dope book on the second day and gone quiet, the good kind of quiet. Salas was the closest thing Wren had to a friend out there. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Salas would fly and call terrain, and Wren would listen, and between them was the kind of understanding 2 competent people build without ever discussing it. "You always this chatty?" Salas had asked her once, after an hour of shared silence in the ready tent. "Only around people I like," Wren said, not looking up from her rifle. Salas had laughed, a short bark of a thing. "God help the ones you don't." That was the closest Wren came to warm, most days. But it was real. There was a night the generator died, and the whole camp went dark and cold, and Wren had produced, from the bottom of her ruck, a single foil packet of the good cocoa, the kind you couldn't get in the field, and she and Salas had split it in the dark, passing one canteen cup, back and forth. And Wren had done an impression of Ackerman explaining windage that was so precise and so merciless that Salas had to press her sleeve against her mouth to keep from waking the tent. For 4 minutes, Wren Kovach was the funniest person in that country. Then the generator came back, and she went quiet again, and the cup was empty. And Salas thought, not for the first time, that the Army had no idea what it had. There was a mechanic, too, a specialist named Ruiz, who kept the ground vehicles running, and one afternoon he watched Wren clear a jammed weapon for a private who'd panicked over it. She didn't lecture. She didn't take over. She put her hands over the kid's hands and walked them through it, slow, until the kid did it himself, and grinned like he'd invented fire. It took 90 seconds. Ruiz stood by his truck, holding a wrench he'd forgotten he was holding. He couldn't have told you why it stuck with him. Something about how little of it there was. No wasted motion, no wasted word. She'd fixed the gun and the private at the same time, and made neither of them a story about herself. He went back to his engine and thought about it for the rest of the day, and never found the words, and put it away, and did not know yet that he'd need it. The crisis came at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, the way they always do, tearing a hole in the middle of an ordinary sleep. A special operations aviation crew, 4 men, a downed helicopter, a hard landing in bad country, had missed 3 consecutive check-ins. The last transmission was a location and a single word: surrounded. By the time the task force had eyes overhead, the crash site was empty and cold, and the 4 men had been walked north into the one compound in the entire sector that nobody had a plan for. Mud walls 12 feet high, 1 gate, high ground on 3 sides held by people who wanted them dead. A relief column would take 14 hours and arrive to bodies. 4, the operations officer said into the pack tent, and his voice was flat because flat was all he had left. We have 4 living Americans in that compound as of the last drone pass. 4. And a window that closes at sunrise, because at sunrise they move them, and if they move them, we lose them for good. 4. The number sat in the tent like a live thing. Every plan died on the whiteboard. Too many guns on the high ground. No angle for the aircraft. No breach that didn't cost more men than it saved. And the one asset who might thread it, the one shooter who could hold that high ground still long enough for a team to get in and out, was 200 clicks south on a solo Overwatch task listed 19 hours ago as killed in action because her position had gone dark in a firefight and nobody had heard her voice since. Except she wasn't dead. She'd gone silent to survive. And 40 minutes ago, her sign had come back on the net, faint and calm, asking for a situation report as though she'd never left. The colonel who had signed her death letter stood in that tent and looked at the map and did the math no commander wants to do. He had doubted her. He had let Ackerman's version of her stand because it was easier than fighting it. And he knew it. And he had signed a letter that called her a loss the Army could absorb. Now she was the only door left. He keyed the radio himself. That was the part that cost him. Not the order, but the doing of it with his own hand in front of the tent, where everyone could hear a colonel ask a dead woman for help. Kovac, he said. This is Sunray, actual. I'm going to be honest with you, because you've earned that much, and I didn't give it to you before. He paused. The tent was silent. I had you as gone. I signed the paper. I was wrong about you in more ways than that, and there's no time to list them. I need you to move to grid I'm sending now and hold high ground for a recovery. It's 4 men. It's a bad piece of ground, and I have no right to ask. Will you go? There was a silence on the net that lasted 4 seconds and felt like an hour. Then her voice came back, and it was not the voice of a checkbox or a diversity hire or a small quiet woman who let men talk over her. It was flat and certain and entirely without fear, and every man in that tent heard the difference. Sunray, Kovac, moving now. Tell the recovery team to breach on my mark and not before. A pause. And Colonel, you can tear up the letter. I'm using it for kindling. She moved through the last of the dark, the way water moves through rock, finding the lines that were already there. 6 kilometers of broken ground between her Overwatch hide and the compound, and she covered it low and fast with the rifle across her back and her heart doing the slow, heavy work it did when everything narrowed to a single point. The sky was going the color of a bruise in the east. She had maybe 90 minutes of usable dark left, and she needed all of it. The first complication was the river. It wasn't on her map as anything but a thin blue line, but the spring melt off the mountains had turned it into a fast, cold thing 40 feet across, and there was no going around it in the time she had. She went through it. The water came to her chest and tried to take her legs, and she braced the rifle over her head and picked her crossing off the current the way her grandfather had taught her to pick a shot off the wind, reading where the water doubled and slowed, finding the seam. She came out the far side shaking with cold and did not let herself stop, because stopping was how the cold won. "Kovac, Overwatch 2, came a voice she knew. Salas, up in the little reconnaissance bird, unarmed, flying in the dark she wasn't supposed to fly in, because she'd heard the net light up and she'd put herself in the air without being asked. I've got you on thermal. You're clean to the base of the North Ridge. After that, I lose you in the rocks. Copy. Eyes on the compound? A pause. 4 heat signatures in the east building, close together. That's your package. Guns on the walls. I count 6, maybe 7 up high. And Wren. Salas's voice dropped. There's more of them than we thought. Northeast Tower's got 2, not 1. You didn't hear it from me, but I'd think hard about this. Noted. Wren was already moving. 7 on the high ground and 1 of her. The number should have frightened her. It didn't, quite, and she noticed that it didn't, and filed the noticing away for later, because there was no room for it now. She reached the base of the North Ridge as the black started to gray. The ridge was the whole problem, and the whole solution. A spine of broken rock that ran along the compound's northern wall, high enough to see down into the courtyard, exposed enough that anyone who climbed it in daylight would be seen and killed inside a minute. She had to be up it and settled before the light came. She climbed with her hands and her rifle on her back and her breath loud in her own ears, and twice the rock came loose under her boot and she froze, spread flat against the stone, waiting for a shout that didn't come. Halfway up, the wrong memory arrived. It always came at the worst time. She was 11 again, in the silo hatch, her grandfather's hand flat on her head, and she wanted to be back there so badly it stopped her breath. Not because she was afraid, but because he was gone, and she'd never told him. And here she was, about to maybe die on a rock in a country he couldn't find on a map, with the debt still unpaid. She pressed her forehead to the cold stone. The loud one on top is never the one that gets you. She said it to herself, in his voice. Then she kept climbing. She reached the crest and went flat and built her position in the gray light. Rifle out, legs spread, cheek down, the whole world narrowing to the courtyard below, and the 7 positions on the walls she now had to hold still with 1 gun and her will. The recovery team was moving up behind her, 6 men from a reconnaissance element, low and fast toward the south wall where the breach would go. She could hear their leader in her ear, a staff sergeant named Okafor, breathing hard. Overwatch, recovery. We're 2 minutes from the breach point. Talk to me about the walls. 6 positions I can see, Wren said low. Northeast tower has 2 shooters. Southeast corner, 1. South wall over your breach, 1. West wall, 2. When you breach, they'll all turn toward you. That's when I work. She did the math nobody wanted to say out loud. I can't take all 7 before someone gets a burst into your team. I can take enough. Move fast and trust me to thin them. Copy, Okafor said. And there was a whole world of trust in that one word. given to a woman he'd never met on the say-so of a colonel who'd had her marked dead an hour ago. Then it went wrong, the way it always does. A dog. Somewhere in the compound, a dog started barking, and a man came out into the courtyard with a lamp, and he was walking toward the east building where the 4 crewmen were held, and he had a radio in his hand. And Wren understood in one cold instant that if he reached that building and raised an alarm before the breach, all 4 hostages died in the first 10 seconds. She had a choice that was not part of her primary skill. She could take the shot now, alone, and blow the recovery team's surprise before they were in position, or she could let the man walk and gamble that Okafor was faster than a radio. "Recovery, are you set?" she breathed. "I have a runner about to blow it. Talk to me now." 30 seconds, Overwatch. Hold." The man raised the radio to his mouth. She took him. 1 round, and the courtyard rang with it, and the whole compound woke at once, every position turning. And now it was a fight, and the clock was gone, and there were 4 men in a mud building, and 7 guns coming alive on the walls, and 1 small woman on a rock who had just started the thing before anyone was ready. "Breach! Breach! Breach!" Okafor roared, and the south wall came apart in smoke and noise, and Wren went to work. She did not think in words while she worked. She thought in geometry and time. Northeast tower first, both shooters, before they could bring their heavy gun to bear on the breach, 2 rounds close together, and the tower went quiet. West wall next, the 2 of them swinging toward Okafor's men pouring through the smoke. She took the near one, and the far one dropped a half-second later behind the wall before she could reach him, and she lost him, just lost him. He was there, and then he was gone into the compound's inner dark, and that was a problem for later. Southeast corner, 1 round. South wall, 1 round, right over Okafor's head as his last man cleared the breach. So close, the man felt the round go past and flinched and kept running. 5 down, 2 somewhere she couldn't see. And the number that mattered now was 4. 4 crewmen, still alive as far as anyone knew, in a building Okafor's team was fighting toward room by room. "Kovac, Salas," the recon pilot's voice, tight. "You've got movement on the inner courtyard. 2 shooters repositioning. I can see them. And you can't. They're using the east building itself for cover. They're setting up to hit Okafor's team from behind when they come out with the package." That was the trap. The 2 she'd lost had gone to ground behind the very building the crewmen were in, and there was no angle from the ridge that reached them because the building was in the way. She could not shoot through a mud wall. She had 5 rounds of the fight already fired, and a problem her rifle could not solve from where she lay. "Okafor, hold in the building," she said. "Do not come out the north door. 2 shooters waiting on it. Do not come out." "We've got the package," Okafor's voice came back, ragged and elated and terrified all at once. 4 for 4, Overwatch, all 4 alive, but 2 of them can't walk. They've been worked over hard. We cannot move fast, and we cannot stay. This building is not going to hold. 4 alive. She heard it, and something in her chest that she'd been holding clenched shut for 2 hours loosened 1 notch. 4 for 4. Then it clamped shut again, because 4 alive in a building they couldn't leave was not 4 saved. Inside the building, Staff Sergeant Okafor knelt in the dark next to the man he'd been sent to get. The aviator's name was Danny Whitfield, a warrant officer, 34 years old, and he was in bad shape, but he was awake, and his eyes were clear, and he grabbed Okafor's sleeve with a grip that surprised him. "The other 3, Whitfield said. "You get all 3? "All 3. You're 4 for 4, sir. We got everybody." Whitfield closed his eyes for a second. "My wife's pregnant," he said. Apropos of nothing, The way men say the true thing when they think it might be the last one. Due in March. I told her I'd be back to paint the room. Yellow. She wants it yellow. He laughed, and it turned into a cough. Stupid thing to think about. It's not stupid. Okafor pressed a bandage into the hands of the man next to him and looked at the north door he'd been told not to use. You're going to paint that room, sir. I've got a shooter on the ridge who says so, and I believe her more than I believe most things. She any good? Okafor almost laughed. I've never met her. Colonel had her listed dead this morning. He keyed his radio. Overwatch. We cannot hold. Whatever you're going to do it fast. These men need to move. On the ridge, Wren's hands were doing close. Careful work now. Not shooting, but working the problem, tracing the geometry of the courtyard in her head. The building, the two shooters she couldn't see, the wind coming down off the mountains behind her, the way it had come down off the ridgeline all night. She'd been feeling it on the back of her neck for an hour without thinking about it. Now, she thought about it. The wind. It was pouring down the north face of the mountains, cold air sliding downhill, the way cold air does at dawn, and it was hitting the compound's north wall and doing something there. She'd watched the dust do it, watched the smoke from the breach do it. The wind hit the 12-foot north wall and couldn't go through, so it went up and over, and on the far side, in the lee of the wall, it curled back down and doubled on itself. A seam. The same seam she'd found off a dry field at 11 years old. The wind at her face, on the ridge, was going one way. The wind in the courtyard, in the shadow of that wall, was going the other. And between them was the truth, if she could read it. She keyed the radio, and she made herself slow down, because the thing she was about to do only worked if the man on the other end understood it, and she needed him calm. Okafor, listen to me. I can't shoot those two men directly. The building's in my way, and that's not changing. She breathed. But I've got a mortar in my kit, a single 60mm round and a small tube for exactly this, and I can drop it into that inner courtyard where the rifle can't reach. Here's the problem. That courtyard is small, and there's a hard crosswind off the mountain, and if I read it wrong, I drop it on you instead of them. So I'm not going to read the wind at my face. I'm going to read the wind at the target. Tell me, the smoke from your breach charge, is any of it still hanging in that inner courtyard? Can you see it through a window? A pause. Movement. Okafor's voice. Yeah, there's smoke still curling in there, up against the north wall. It's weird. It's going sideways and then back on itself, like it can't decide. That's not weird. That's the answer. Wren's voice was almost gentle now. That smoke is showing me the wind that matters. The wind down where the round's going to land, not the wind up here where I'm sitting. The wall makes the air roll back on itself. The loud wind's on top. The one that counts is the one moving that smoke. You watch that smoke, and you tell me which way it's pushing, right at the ground, and I'll set my drop off what you see, not off what I feel. You're my eyes on the only wind that matters. It's pushing east. Ground level, it's pushing east, toward the far corner. Hard. East, hard, ground level. Copy. She adjusted the little tube, canted it, set the drop not for the wind screaming down the ridge at her back, but for the quiet reversed current down in the lee of that wall. The seam she'd learned to trust before she was tall enough to reach the top shelf. Get your men against the south wall inside, away from windows, and put something over the two who can't move. This is going to be loud. Tell me when you're set. And Okafor. After this, the north door is clear. You come out fast. Setting now. She heard men moving, heard the grunt of 2 wounded aviators being dragged to cover, heard Whitfield's voice saying, "It's okay. It's okay. She's got us." Then, "Set. We're set. Do it." She dropped the round. And then there was the wait, the long, unbearable wait that nobody who hasn't done it understands. The flight time of a mortar round, going up into the graying sky and coming down somewhere you can't see. 4 seconds, 5, an eternity, in which she had done everything she could do, and the round was out of her hands and out of her control, and reading a wind, she was trusting a stranger to see for her. She lay flat on the rock, and she did not breathe. She thought, absurdly, of her grandfather's hand on her head. She thought, catch the lie. She thought about a nursery painted yellow that she didn't know about yet. The round came down. For 1 whole second, nothing seemed to have happened. The courtyard was quiet. She thought she'd missed. She thought she'd killed them. She thought, in the space of that second, every terrible thing at once. Then Okafor's voice, cracking. On target. On target. Overwatch. Both down. Both hostiles down. The courtyard's clear. How did you? We're moving. We are moving. Coming out the north door now, with all 4. All 4. Do you copy? All 4. She let out the breath she'd been holding. Down below, the recovery team came out of the building into the gray dawn, 6 men carrying and dragging 4, and the compound was quiet around them, and the seam in the wind had held. Copy all 4, she said. Her voice did not shake. Bring them home. I'm covering you out. The engagement complete call, when it came, was the flattest thing in the world. Okafor's voice on the net, 12 minutes later, from the far side of the river, with all his men and all 4 crewmen. All friendlies clear of the objective. Package is 4 souls, all recovered alive. Objective secure. Overwatch, you can come off the hill. Objective secure. 2 words for the thing that 100 men had said was impossible 8 hours ago. Wren did not move for a moment. She lay on the rock with the light coming up full now, and the rifle quiet under her hands, and she noticed that her hands had started to shake. Not before, not during. Now, with the work done and the men across the river, her hands shook so hard she had to lace her fingers together and press them flat against the stone to make them stop. She lay there, and she let them shake. There was no one to see. The number in her head had stopped falling. 4. It had held at 4. She had not lost one. She keyed the radio one last time from the ridge, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not, because she had learned a long time ago that those 2 things did not have to match. Sunray, Kovac, coming off the hill. Tell the aviators' families they can stop waiting. A pause. And, Colonel, the letter. I meant what I said about the kindling. She got 2 hours of gray half-sleep in the back of a transport, and then they put her in a room with a woman she'd never met, a review officer flown in from the regional command, a major named Ellison, with a laptop and a list of questions, and a face that said she had already decided what she was going to find. Sergeant Kovac. Ellison did not look up. I've been asked to reconcile the operational record with the personnel file, and I'll be honest, the 2 don't fit together. So, I'm going to ask you to walk me through it. You were listed as killed in action yesterday. Explain how that happened. My position went dark in a firefight. I broke my radio going to ground, and I stayed dark to stay alive. Standard, ma'am. The listing was a reasonable call with the information they had. Reasonable? Ellison typed something. And then a woman who was, on paper, dead, crossed 6 kilometers of contested ground alone, forded a river in flood, climbed an exposed ridge in the dark, held 7 enemy positions with a single rifle, and dropped a mortar round into a courtyard she could not see, using— She checked her notes, and her voice took on an edge of open disbelief. Using cigarette smoke, apparently, to read the wind. Does that about cover it? It wasn't cigarette smoke. It was residual smoke from the breach charge. And I didn't read the wind, ma'am. Staff Sergeant Okafor read it. I just trusted what he saw over what I felt. Ellison finally looked up. Sergeant, I've been doing these reviews for 11 years. Do you understand what I usually find when the record says a small precision shooter single-handedly pulled off something like this? I find an exaggeration. I find a team that gave the credit to one person for morale. I find a story that got bigger every time it was told. She leaned forward. So help me understand why I shouldn't file this as embellishment. You want to know if I really did it? Wren's voice was flat. I understand. You should check. I intend to. Then don't ask me. Ask Okafor how he knew the north door was clear. Ask him who told him to watch the smoke, and why. Ask the drone footage where the 2 inner courtyard shooters were standing, and where the round landed, and how far apart those 2 spots are, because if I embellished it, the round landed somewhere it couldn't have. Ask Warrant Officer Salas why she put an unarmed aircraft in the dark over a hot compound without an order. And ask yourself, ma'am, if this is a story a team invented for morale, why did they invent one where the hero was a woman most of them had never met, who half the camp had marked as a checkbox, and who was listed dead when the whole thing started? That's a strange lie to tell. She stopped. Check the record. It'll hold. Ellison looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned the laptop around, and on the screen was the drone footage, already cued. And she'd clearly watched it before she walked in, and Wren understood that the whole thing had been a test, not of the facts, but of the woman. Ellison had needed to see whether Wren would inflate it herself, and she hadn't, and that was the last piece. The round landed 4 meters from the 2 hostiles, Ellison said quietly, closing the laptop. In a courtyard 11 meters across, with a crosswind, the meteorological data confirms, was doing exactly what you said it was doing against that wall. There's no version of that number that's a lie. She sat back. I came here to find an exaggeration, Sergeant. I found the opposite. I found a record that undersells it, because the paperwork doesn't have a box for what you did. She was quiet a moment. I'm going to fix some of that. That's a promise. That night, Wren couldn't sleep, and neither could Whitfield, the aviator, the one with the pregnant wife, and the yellow room. And they ended up in the dark, at the edge of the camp. 2 survivors on a couple of ammo crates, the mountains black against a sky full of hard desert stars. I keep doing the math, Whitfield said. His voice was rough. 2 days of captivity had left marks that didn't show in the dark. You know they had us on our knees. They had us lined up, and I did the math on how many hours I had left. I got it down to a number, and then the wall came apart. He turned his head toward her. I don't know how to hold that. That there was a number, and then there wasn't. Wren was quiet for a while. When she spoke, it was the thing she had told no one, the thing she wasn't sure she'd ever say out loud. When I took the runner, the first shot, the one that started the whole fight before anyone was ready. She stared out at the dark. I've told myself all day I did it because he'd have raised the alarm and gotten all 4 of you killed. And that's true, but that's not the only reason. Her jaw worked. I did it because I was afraid Okafor wasn't fast enough, and I'd rather start the fight on my terms than trust another person with your lives. I didn't trust the plan. I trusted myself. And if I'd been wrong about the timing, I'd have gotten your whole recovery team killed to save myself from being scared. She let it sit. That's not what a good shooter does. A good shooter holds. I didn't hold. Whitfield didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was gentle and certain. Sergeant, can I tell you what I saw? 'Cause I was there and you weren't down in that building. He shifted on the crate. You held 7 guns off 6 men who'd have died without you. You took a shot you had no angle for and put it 4 meters off a target you couldn't see, on faith, off a wind another guy called for you. You did the one thing that saved us, and you're sitting here in the dark, calling yourself a coward for it. He shook his head. You want to know what I think? I think you've spent so long being told you're small that you can't hear it when you do something big. You've got the story backwards. You didn't fail to hold. You held the whole time. You held me. My wife is going to have our kid in March because a woman who was listed dead decided she wasn't. His voice broke, just slightly. Don't you dare tell that woman she's a coward. I need her to be exactly who she was this morning. Wren didn't say anything, but in the dark, something in her shoulders came down half an inch, and she let it. The debt she'd carried up every hill, the grandfather, the missed funeral, the sorry never said, that got answered too, and not by anyone who'd known him. It was Salis. The morning after, the recon pilot found Wren cleaning her rifle in the shade of a Connex, and she sat down across from her without being asked, the way she always did, and she was quiet for a while. And then she said, I heard you say something on the ridge. In the middle of it. You keyed the radio by accident, I think, for about a second, right before you climbed. You said, the loud one on top is never the one that gets you. You said it like a prayer. Wren's hands went still on the rifle. My father used to fly crop dusters, Salis said, looking out at the mountains, before I ever touched an aircraft. And he used to tell me the sky's got layers, and the wind you feel isn't the wind that kills you. And I hated him for saying it because I was 14, and he was always right. She smiled, a small sad thing. He's gone now, 10 years, and I never told him he was right about the wind. Never told him he was right about most things. I thought I had time. She looked at Wren. I heard you say his lesson in another man's words at the worst moment of your life, and I thought, that man is still teaching. Whoever he was. He's up on that ridge with you dropping rounds into courtyards. You didn't miss anything, Wren. He's not in the ground. He's in your hands. I watched him work yesterday. Wren looked down at the rifle. Her eyes were wet, and she let them be. I never told him I was sorry I missed the funeral, she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud in 2 years. You don't tell them, Salis said simply. You carry them, and you did. You carried him up a ridge in the dark and used what he gave you to save 4 men. And if that's not sorry, if that's not the whole of sorry, then I don't know what the word's for. She stood and put one hand flat on the top of Wren's head for a second, the exact gesture, though she couldn't have known it, and walked away, and left Wren sitting in the shade with the stone in her chest finally, lighter than it had been. Ackerman came to her on the 3rd day. He'd done something first, which was the only reason she let him talk. He'd stood up in the after-action review in front of the colonel and the review officer and the whole precision element, and he'd been asked, directly, to assess the shot, the mortar drop, the wind read, the whole thing, and everyone in the room knew he could have shaded it, could have called it lucky, could have said any of us could have done it with the right setup. Instead, he'd stood there, and his jaw had worked, and he'd said, I've been shooting for 19 years, and I could not have made that read. I'd have shot the wind at my own face and dropped it on our own men. She read a wind she couldn't feel off smoke she couldn't touch, and trusted a stranger to see it for her, which is the part I really couldn't have done, because I don't trust like that. He'd sat down. It had cost him something visible. That was the risk before the apology. So when he found her at the ammo point, she let him talk. Kovac. He stood there with his hands useless at his sides. I need to... He stopped, started again. The first week in the chow tent, what I said about carrying your own gun. Physics is physics. His jaw worked. I said it because you were small and quiet, and I'd already decided that meant I'd already... He stopped again, and this time he didn't restart with an excuse. There's no end of that sentence that isn't me admitting I was a smaller man than I want to be. I looked at you, and I saw a checkbox. And you're the best shooter I have ever personally watched work. And I said the thing I said in front of everyone. And I don't know how to take it back, because you can't take those things back. You can only... He ran out. Wren looked at him for a moment. Then, don't take it back, she said. Just don't say it about the next one. Ackerman blinked. It was not forgiveness, and it was not punishment. It was an instruction, and it was more than he'd hoped for. And he nodded once and left, and did not say another word about carrying guns to anyone ever again. And years later, a young shooter half his size would arrive at his element, and he would remember this and keep his mouth shut and watch her work first, and never know that the not saying was the whole of what she'd asked him for. The letter reached her a week later. Not a military one. A civilian envelope, water-stained, forwarded 3 times, addressed in a careful hand. It was from Danny Whitfield's wife. She'd gotten Wren's name from Danny, and she wrote the way people write when the words are too big for the paper. She did not use a single military term. She wrote that she was 7 months along. She wrote that Danny had come home and slept for 2 days, and then gotten up and finished painting the nursery, yellow, the way she'd wanted, and that she'd found him standing in the doorway of it afterward just looking, and that when she asked him what he was doing, he'd said he was making sure it was real. She wrote that she didn't know how to thank a person for the fact that her child would have a father, that there was no size of thank you that fit, that she'd started this letter 4 times. She wrote, I don't know you. I will probably never meet you. But my son is going to know your name before he knows the alphabet. And every birthday he has is one you gave him. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful to a stranger. And I don't know how to hold something that big. So I'm just going to say thank you and hope you can feel how much is underneath it. Wren read it 3 times and did not know what to do with her face. She, who always had a flat answer, who could talk a man through a mortar shot with her voice level, sat on a crate holding a piece of paper from a woman she'd never met and could not, for the life of her, figure out how to receive it. There was no fact she could answer this with. There was no windage. She folded it up very carefully and put it in the dope book where she kept the numbers that mattered, and that was where it stayed. The recognition came at the end of the rotation in a plywood-floored briefing room that smelled of dust and burnt coffee, and Wren did not know it was coming. The colonel stood up to close the after-action, and he did not do the thing commanders usually do. He didn't read a citation. He set his notes down and looked at the room, at the 60-odd men and women packed into it, and he said, 9 days ago, I signed a letter that said Sergeant Kovac was a loss this task force could absorb. I want to talk about that letter because I signed it. And it's the worst thing I've put my name to in 22 years. And not because she lived, because of what it says about what I saw when I looked at her, which was nothing. I saw nothing. And nothing is what I'd been letting this whole element see, because it was easier. The room had gone very still. Sergeant Kovac, stand up. She stood, because you don't refuse a colonel, but she stood the way she did everything, economical and quiet, and she did not know where to look. And then it happened, and it happened from the back first. It was Ruiz, the mechanic, the one who'd watched her clear a jammed weapon in 90 seconds and never found the words. He stood up, just stood, in the back, a specialist, standing in a room full of people who outranked him, and his chair scraped loud in the silence. And he didn't say anything because he still didn't have the words. He just stood, so she'd know he'd seen it, the 90 seconds and everything after. Then Okafor stood, and the 5 men of his recovery team stood with him, all 6 at once, the men who'd been in that building, and one of them was crying and not bothering to hide it. Then Salas, then Foss, the lieutenant, the kid from the chow tent who'd seen the 2 versions of her on the first day, and only now understood which one was real. Then Ackerman stood, and standing cost him more than it cost anyone in that room. And everyone knew it, and he did it anyway, and his face was a wreck. And then the whole room was on its feet, 60 people, and it was silent. That was the thing Wren would remember, that nobody cheered, nobody clapped. They just stood, because clapping was too small, and they all knew it. The silence had a sound. It was the sound of 60 people who had signed her death letter, or read it, or believed it, standing up to say they'd been wrong with the only currency that couldn't be faked, which was their own 2 feet. The colonel could not look at her. He looked at the floor, and his jaw was tight, because he was the one who'd signed it, and standing didn't undo that, and he knew it. The review officer, Ellison, stood at the side with her arms crossed and looked straight at Wren, unwavering, the only one who could, because she'd come to find a lie, and found this instead, and wanted Wren to see one face that had never doubted the record once it was checked. And Wren stood in the middle of it, small, level-eyed, and barely moved. She put her hand once, flat, on the table in front of her, the way her grandfather used to put his hand flat on the top of her head, and she left it there. And that was the only thing she did. The room stood around her for a long time. Nobody counted the seconds. Nobody needed to. Ruiz found her afterward, outside, when the room had emptied. He'd been the first up, and he still didn't have a speech. But he'd found one sentence on the long walk out, and he gave it to her. The plainest thing anyone said in that whole country. I watched you fix a gun and a scared kid at the same time, and not make it about yourself, he said. That was before any of this. That was just a Tuesday. He looked at his boots. I couldn't say why it stuck with me till now, but that's who did that shot. Same person who fixed the gun. You didn't turn into somebody on that ridge. You were already her. The rest of us just weren't looking. He nodded, embarrassed, and walked off. And it was the truest summary of Wren Kovac anyone ever managed. And it came from a specialist with a wrench who'd known her for a Tuesday. 14 months later, the war had moved, and the people in it had scattered the way they do. Danny Whitfield left the Army. His son was born in March, healthy and loud, and they named him after Danny's grandfather, and not after anyone from that country, which was right, because that country was not the kind of thing you name a child after. But Danny hung a photograph in the yellow room, up high, where a toddler couldn't reach. And it was not a photograph of Wren, because he didn't have one. It was a photograph of a ridge. He'd asked Okafor for it. Just the ridge, gray in the dawn. The place a woman had lain down and held the whole sky still so his boy could exist. His son would ask about it someday. Danny had the answer ready. Petra Salas made Chief Warrant Officer 5 and took a posting training the next generation of reconnaissance pilots, and the first thing she taught every one of them, before the aircraft, before the systems, was that the sky has layers, and the wind you feel is not the wind that kills you. And she never told them where she'd learned to say it that way. In those words, from a small sergeant on a ridge, who'd learned it from a man in a silo, who'd learned it God knew where. It went down the line. It kept going. It outlived everyone who knew where it started. And Wren stayed in. She made the shot everyone would talk about for a decade, and she paid for it in a way nobody could see on paper, which was this: she could not sleep in the quiet anymore. The absolute silence of the desert night, the kind she'd loved, the kind she'd grown up with on the farm. It stopped being rest for her and started being the 4 seconds of a mortar round's flight time, over and over, the wait, the second where nothing had happened yet and everything might have gone wrong. She learned to sleep with a small fan running, with a radio hissing low, with any sound at all, because sound meant the wait was over, and the round had landed. She never got the quiet back. That was the cost, and she carried it. And she did not complain, because 4 men were alive, and one of them was painting a room yellow. And that trade was one she'd make again, every single time. They asked her once, a young officer at a school she was teaching at, how she'd known to trust the smoke, how she'd known the wind at the wall was the one that mattered, and not the wind at her face. Because the loud one on top is never the one that gets you, she said. Somebody taught me that a long time ago. He's still teaching it, apparently. It got all the way to you. And she left it there, and the young officer wrote it down without fully understanding it, and would understand it in about 9 years, in a bad moment, when it would be the thing that saved someone. She went back to the farm on her next long leave. Her grandfather's silo was still standing, leaning a little, the ladder rustier than it had been. She climbed it anyway, up to the top hatch, and sat with her legs hanging out over 100 feet of nothing the way she had at 11, and she watched the dust twist off the dry field 300 yards out, curling and doubling back, where 2 currents met, showing her the seam, the truth under the lie. The wind at her face said one thing. The wind out there did another. Between them was everything he'd given her. She didn't shoot anything. She didn't need to. She just sat in the place where it started, level-eyed and quiet, and finally entirely at peace, reading a wind that only she and 1 dead man and a whole line of pilots she'd never meet knew how to read, and let the loud wind pass over the top of her, and caught the lie the way she always had, the way she always would, the way she'd taught the world to do without any of them knowing his name.